Welcome to everyone to SOAS and those who are also joining us tonight, including our global audience who are watching via the live stream on the SOAS Facebook page. It's an absolute pleasure to be hosting the Migration Museum's annual lecture here at SOAS, and it's a particular pleasure to welcome David. The Migration Museum, based in Lambeth, is taking an innovative approach to examining the history of movement through events, exhibitions, and education workshops. So we are part of that. Much like what this evening's talk will be exploring, the work of the museum is about recovering the global aspects of our history and culture. So much of how we understand the present is clouded by misrepresentation of our history, particularly in relation to the movement of people and power struggles between nations and the impact of conflict. In the last few years, we've seen an extremely divisive public debate here in Britain on immigration. A debate which I think is reflected in other countries, in Europe, and of course, in the United States. Tonight's lecture, entitled The Perils of Our Insular Illusion, great title, David, by the way, is a theme which is very much at the heart of the work that we do here at SOAS. SOAS staff and students have engaged in some difficult conversations around decolonising knowledge. It's not an easy agenda to grapple with, as we see from some of the derogatory comments which sometimes follow this work. Some of it, of course, aimed at us here at SOAS. Any challenge to particular narratives about our history, for example, the relationship of this country to its colonies, the way that Britain developed off the back of the slave trade, are considered to be taboo subjects by people who don't want to discuss that difficult narrative. And yet the best scholarship reflects the range of experiences of the people both inside and outside the UK. If we're not challenging those perspectives, what exactly are we here for? So a few words from me about our speaker this evening. David has been at the forefront of challenging traditional narratives of our history and how we see it. His achievements include, of course, contribution to the BBC Two's epic series Civilisations, and also a number of award-winning books. For me, what is particularly significant about David's work is how he has shifted public awareness of lesser known but extremely important aspects of British history. This year, as we marked 100 years since the end of the First World War, we saw more stories emerge of the forgotten soldiers, for example, from Commonwealth countries who fought for this country. David has been instrumental in making us think about those who should be remembered and has played a major role in taking us all on this journey. We'll hear from David in a moment, and there'll be a fuller introduction of him as well. But first, please welcome Barbara Roach, friend and colleague, Chair of the Trustees of the Migration Museum.
Thank you very, very much indeed, Valerie, and thank you very much for giving the context to this evening. Thank you as well for being our partner and our host for this evening. We're absolutely delighted to be here. And as we're here, can I also take this opportunity to thank you very warmly for the many SOAS students, both currently and in the past, who've worked with us, who've been our volunteers. We really value them. They're essential to our work. And if any people from SOAS, staff, students are interested in working with us, in volunteering from us, please do let us know. There'll be some of our colleagues with these badges on, so please approach them at the end of the evening. We'd be delighted to have you. I can't tell you what a great pleasure it is, David, to have you, and a real honour for us. This is our 5th annual lecture, and I'm really looking forward to this evening. A brief further word about the museum. Our aim is to establish the first permanent site for a national migration museum in the UK, which will tell the story. Long overdue, and we are really working towards it, but we do need your help. So on your seats, you will find a leaflet about what we do and what our activities are. And please, if you're interested, and I hope you all are, do sign on to our mailing list. There's another leaflet there which tells you about our current exhibition, a very new exhibition, already incredibly well reviewed, Room to Breathe. Do come along to see it. I think I feel I can say it really is the most fantastic exhibition, so please do go along to see it. It just really remains for me just to thank you again for coming here, to introduce Robert Winder, my fellow trustee, one of the founding trustees of the Migration Museum, who is going to act as host, moderator, keeping us all in order this evening. As you all know, Robert is the author of, I think, the best book on the history of migration, and has very much been one of our inspirations for the museum. And as somebody who's a terrible plagiarist, who once made a speech as a student denouncing plagiarism, while at the same time reading from a speech that I hadn't written, or indeed wasn't even in my own handwriting. As an arch plagiarist, I always use what Robert says in his book. The thing about migration is it's not how long we've been here. What really divides us is just how long ago it is that we came. We all came from somewhere else. The only question is how long ago. So what we seek to do at the museum is to actually unite people by it being about all of us. Thank you very much indeed. Robert, over to you.
Well, thank you all very much for coming, and thank you for those words too. I've just flown in a couple of days ago from India, from Mumbai, so I was rather tempted to say tonight, if I was still there, that it was marvellous of you all to make this effort to come out on such an incredibly hot and sultry night. But things are a little bit different here, so we're all having to adjust, but it's great to see you all. Now, the obvious thing to say about David is that he needs no introduction, which is very inconvenient for me, since my only real job this evening is to introduce him. So I will merely say that he was born in 1970 in Lagos, Nigeria, and came to Britain as a young boy and lived in Newcastle. And I've never been to Lagos, but I have a sort of sense that it's not a bit like Newcastle. And so, of course, he had to encounter the things that all people who switch countries encounter, which is a completely different climate and weather, food, daily life, school, neighbourhoods, and obviously the thorny issues around race and identity as well. And it would be trite to say there could ever really be a silver lining to those thorny problems, because they're so unpleasant. But in David's case, it did inspire in him a tremendous and energetic love of history, in particular the history, as he said, that led to his own existence. And that compelled him to study, obviously, the history of the British involvement with and interference in West Africa, and the history of the slave trade, and all of these nightmares from which we are still struggling to awake. And he's helping to wake us up. And it's tremendous work he does. And he's since become a very distinguished broadcaster and writer in all these vexed areas of race and empire and history and war and identity. But above all, I think history. He's almost the embodiment of the idea that history is not just an interesting field of scholarship at universities. It's actually a living presence in all of our everyday lives. We walk in its footprints all the time. The only question is, how aware of them are we? And he's here to make us more aware. And nothing about this is ever simple. He's always insistent on that point. I mean, I've, for a long time, and history teachers always like to emphasize the famous George Santayana saying that people who do not study history are condemned to repeat it. But the trouble with that, I've increasingly found out, is that people who do study history are condemned to look on helplessly while everyone else repeats it. But to help us navigate and untangle that and other mysteries, David Olusoga.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you. Well, thank you very much for inviting me here. Thank you to the Migration Museum and thank you to SOAS. I thought it was a great title as well, Vab. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought it sounds like a sort of pretentious Philip Glass novel or a bad translation of a Michel Houellebecq novel. So I'm glad you like it. I'm going to start seeing it as I first did as a rather clever title and put aside my reservations. I wanted to start, as all stories should, with an anecdote, with an event didn't happen to me, but an event that happened earlier this year. And it's an event that speaks, I think, to many of the tensions and many of the fabricated tensions of this moment that we're living through. And it took place back in January when a group of students, maybe some people in this room, I don't know, stormed the Blighty Cafe in Finsbury Park. We've got some of them in? Great. The cafe, if you don't know, is a Second World War themed cafe with lots of images of Winston Churchill. And the owners were accused by the activists of trivializing colonialism and glamorizing the empire. Some of the activists chanted Churchill was a racist. The right-wing tabloids predictably had a field day. The Daily Express said, lefty loons terrorize Winston Churchill-inspired cafe. The Sun called the protesters a lefty mob. I could at this point, of course, quote from the Daily Mail, but you can all imagine what the Daily Mail said. The Daily Mail of the Decca era, they don't really need journalists. They just need an algorithm into which they feed the day's events and print what comes out. But in all of that shouting, with the Daily Mail's legions of the outraged on the march, Boris Johnson tweeting that it was all disgraceful, and the usual suspects busy monetizing their outrage on Twitter and talk radio, what I loved about the story, and what lots of historians of empire loved about the story, was the name that had been given to this Second World War themed pub with its Churchills and its Bulldogs and its Spitfires and its obligatory keep calm and carry on posters. What we loved is that that word is not what people think it is. Blighty is not an affectionate term for the exceptionalist, splendid isolation, sceptred isle version of Britain. It's not a term that was invented, as many people think, by Tommies in the trenches of the First World War, although it was used widely by British soldiers in that conflict and in the war that followed. But the word Blighty wasn't even born in Britain. It emerged from the other history of Britain, the history of Britain I'm interested in, the history of another British culture, of the real Britain, of a nation that was forged by the creation and exploitation of the biggest empire the world has ever seen, an empire that began in the age of Elizabeth I and lasted until the reign of Elizabeth II. The Britain that was a colonial power, its economy, demographics, culture, language, all shaped, reshaped, reimagined, reflective of global trade, cultural conflict, contact, and migration. Blighty is a corruption of the Hindi word violati, which means foreign or abroad or British or of Britain. And it seems to have emerged by the 1880s, though it may well have been in use in British India at an earlier date. And it became popular, almost universal, during the First World War. And that's perhaps not surprising, because it was in the First World War that 90,000 Indian soldiers and their white officers who spoke Indian languages and who were themselves residents of British India came to the Western Front, transported within weeks of the outbreak of war. By the end of September 1914, they were in Marseille. By October, they were on what was about to become the Western Front, facing the German army. Like many of our words, and like many aspects of our culture, Blighty, it's a hybrid. I think the best word to describe what it is to use is another adopted phrase, this time from Jamaican English. Blighty is a mashup. So the affectionate, nostalgic, yearning nickname that we have given to our nation was created by the coming together of two cultures and two languages. It is a relic of the age of empire, trade, migration, cultural conflict, and the empire. Yet, like much else, the word has been stripped of its dual heritage and its imperial identity. And more than that, it is often used to denote that other Britain, the island story Britain, the myth of insularity, which is very often coupled with the more insidious myth of ethnic and racial purity. And the word blighty is not a unique case. As an immigrant to this country, a person who, while being dual national, is in so many ways profoundly culturally British, and as an historian always interested in empire, I've long talked about this strange, almost schizophrenic act of doublethink that we have in this country. Many of us like to remember, and arguably misremember, the empire as the most vast and powerful the world had ever known, and many people are indeed drawn to the view that the empire offers some sort of model for our future relations with the outside world. In October of this year, a man interviewed in a vox pop by Sky News, who was attending the Save Brexit rally in Yorkshire, explained his support for Brexit in the following terms. "We're British," he said. "We stood alone for years. I was watching a thing with the Queen in it. There's billions of people in the empire. Let's get back to being the British Empire again. That's what it's all about. It's about being the British Empire." Yeah, it takes a while to sink in, doesn't it? And yet, despite the fact that so many people regard the empire as the central feature of British history, and despite the fact that so many people like to compare Britain's empire positively, both in terms of scale and allegedly in terms of its moral outlook to other empires, we have this strange habit of being obsessed by the empire and being in denial of it at the same time. We indulge in this delusion of isolation and exceptionalism. We accept the empire as a great heroic myth, but we deny the multiple ways in which our language, culture, demographics, history, and identity were shaped by foreign or colonial roots. I'm an historian by both training and by passion, and I always have a tendency to see the present through the aperture of the past. And what I want to argue here this evening is that one of our difficulties with migration, one of the reasons why debates around immigration dominate our current politics, is that the forces of movement and migration in the 21st century have been characterized as a great disruption, a profound break with the past, a discontinuity with a longer version of British history that is imagined to be settled and isolated. Now, we must never fall into the trap of pretending that migration after the Second World War was not in lots of ways novel, and that it has profoundly changed Britain. But the extent and the nature of that change is made to seem all the more greater and of all the more profoundly disruptive because of the ways we've tended to write and remember our history. Like many nations, we've tended to focus on the parts of the past in which we look good, and either leave out or rush through the parts of the past where we look less good. But more than that, I think, we've convinced ourselves that our empire was unique in a way that no other was. And the man who best expressed this myth of uniqueness and of exceptionalism was your friend and mine, Enoch Powell. Back in 1961, 2 years before he was being chauffeured around by the young Nigel Farage, Enoch Powell gave an astonishing speech, but it's not the speech you think it is. This speech took place on St. George's Day, 1961, almost to the day 7 years before his infamous Rivers of Blood speech. In 1961, Powell spoke to the Royal Society of St. George, and he began by asking the rhetorical question about what the empire and its rapid, at the time, dissolution, what it meant for Britain. He then went on to make an absolutely startling claim. He suggested that the British Empire had been unique, and unique in ways that few commentators and few historians had managed to notice. Only Powell had been able to see this. There was, he said, this deep providential difference between our empire and those of others. What was special, Powell said, about the British Empire was that the nationhood of the mother country had, according to him, remained unaltered through it all, almost unconscious of this strange, fantastic structure that had been built around it. So despite having assembled the greatest empire the world had ever known, Britain, Powell believed, had somehow remained, in his word, uninvolved in the whole enterprise. During the Age of Empire, when Britain was able to dominate a quarter of the world, an era that Powell himself rightly said had come about because of a brief conjunction between cheap and invincible sea power and industrial potential, much of the world had been brought under what he called the spell of England. Powell often began speeches talking about Britain and then slipped subconsciously into talking about what he was really interested in, which was England. But that experience had not been reciprocal. The rest of the world had fallen under the spell of Britain, but Britain had not fallen under the spell, he believed, of its conquered territories. And the deep inner core of the English character and the essential nature of England's institutions, he believed, had passed through 4 centuries of empire building and imperial domination, largely unchanged, unaffected, uninvolved. In his most romantic passage, and Powell was a brilliant writer, he said, "Backwards travels our gaze, beyond the grenadiers and the philosophers of the 18th century, beyond the pikemen and the preachers of the 17th, back through the brash, adventurous days of the First Elizabeth and the hard materialism of the Tudors. And there, at last, we find them, our English ancestors." Powell believed the people of 1961 had to reach back through time 4 centuries, through the Age of Empire, and somehow commune, hold hands with the people of the early Tudor age. This was a vision of Britain, of British purity and continuity, which didn't match the realities of the nation that Powell was speaking about. The speech was delivered near the peak of Caribbean migration to Britain. Around 60,000 Caribbean migrants arrived in Britain in 1961, and they, new arrivals, joined the estimated 200,000 who were already here. By the end of the decade, the community would number more than 500,000. Those black and brown Britons were to Powell and men like him a constant reminder of the lost empire and the connections and interconnections that had made Britain powerful. But let's not forget that Powell's vision of Britain would neither have matched the realities of the Britain of the 1860s, never mind the 1960s, when immigration from Ireland, from mainland Europe, and emigration to the US, Canada, and South Africa was reaching its peak. There are many, many incredible or breathtaking statistics about the British Empire, but one of the most breathtaking is one of the most forgotten. That between 1815 and 1914, 22 million people emigrated from the British Isles, Britain and Ireland. What in the late 20th century became known as Powellism was a call, a plea, made by, ironically, a scholar of the classical past for the denial and the disavowal of parts of 400 years of British history, the histories of emigration and immigration, and of much else. The loss of the British Empire in the 1960s, in Powell's view, made the jettisoning of all of that imperial history necessary, as it was only through the amputation of that part of British history that the English people of 1961 could be recovered as an ethnic state. It was only counterintuitively by turning their backs on English history that the English could themselves once again be truly English in Powell's view. Powell's vision of a Britain that was unique, exceptional, and succored on the sap of the oak of England could only be conjured into temporal existence by the jettisoning of 400 years of British history. It was a vision of Britain that was illusory, a Britain purged of empire, freed from the past, re-energized by a new national and racial self-consciousness, and it was a fantasy, and it was a dangerous one. It was, in many ways, the St. George's Day speech of 1961, the ultimate and most eloquent expression of the island story narrative of our past, an insular delusion. A mindset in which our connections to other people and other places and the role in the life of this nation, of the people who came here, was marginalized and denied. What's most dangerous about it was that the history that Enoch Powell was so eager for us to forget, to amputate from our minds, was the very history that then and now explains where what he called the immigrant descended population had come from, who they were, what they had been through, what their connections to the British Isles were, and why they were here. When in later decades, the Jamaican-born British intellectual Stuart Hall explained to his readers that the immigrants were here because you were there, he was seeking to remake the connections that Powell had been seeking to break. There had been and still existed what Professor Hall called an umbilical connection between Britain and the Commonwealth. And there could be, in his words, no understanding of Englishness without understanding its imperial and colonial dimensions. I'm first and foremost a historian of empire, but we have a similar insular delusion when it comes to Europe. Our tendency to tell partial histories about empire, migration, and cultural synthesis is twinned by that other national blind spot. And here again, the myth of insularity and isolation distorts how we see the past, how we see ourselves, and how we see others. In 2015, the Facebook page of the far-right organisation Britain First showed a cobbled-together amateurish poster that at its centre had a picture of a Spitfire. Unfortunately, the plane the political masterminds of Britain First had chosen as the ultimate expression and symbol of Britain alone and isolated against the world was from 303 Squadron of the RAF, a squadron made up of Polish and Czech airmen who had escaped from France in 1940. 303 Squadron and another Polish Squadron, 302, shot down 203 enemy aircraft during the war. 303 Squadron was the most successful unit in fighter command in the Battle of Britain. It shot down 126 German aircraft in 42 days. In his final dispatch, Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, the man who had led fighter command through the Battle of Britain, wrote, "Had it not been for the magnificent material contributed by the Polish squadrons and their unsurpassed gallantry, I hesitate to say that the outcome of the battle would have been the same." 29 Polish pilots were killed in this struggle. The particular plane Britain First had chosen to put on their website was flown by the Czech pilot Jan Zumbak. Please forgive me, anyone who speaks Czech in the audience. That was an appalling translation, I've been told. Had Britain First consulted an historian, had Britain First ever met an historian, they would have pointed out to them that the plane in their poster clearly bears the red and white insignia of the Polish Air Force. Under normal circumstances, this would just be another dumb, lazy mistake, not to mention an incredible and disrespectful act of historical appropriation. But what makes it even more laughable is that just 5 years earlier, another right-wing party, the BNP, had made exactly the same mistake. In 2009, their European election poster showed another image of a Spitfire, again from 303 Squadron, with the slogan, "The Battle for Britain." Both of these far-right movements, Britain First and the BNP, used the icon of the Spitfire to invoke a distorted historical memory of the Battle of Britain, and to imply that their 21st century anti-immigration stance was, in some distorted way, a comparable struggle. One fought by British people against people of other nations for the future of the country, a definition that might well accurately reflect their imagined ethno-political campaign, but that does not reflect the realities of the Second World War and the realities of the men who fought in British planes and who died in British uniforms in that conflict and in the conflict before. Yet even at the time during the Second World War, the seeds of this idea were being sown. There were those in this country who believed and even revelled in the unreal idea that Britain, between the fall of France and the launch of Hitler's campaign against the USSR, stood alone. After Dunkirk, King George wrote in a letter to his mother, Queen Mary, "Personally, I feel happier now we have no allies to be polite to and to pamper." Around the same time, a Whitehall office keeper remarked to a senior civil servant, "Well, we're in the final now, sir. It's all going to be played on our home ground." And a British officer, fresh from the beaches of Dunkirk, who had seen the war at first hand, on hearing the news of the surrender of France in 1940, wrote, "Thank heavens they have. Now at last we can get on with the war." Yet at the very same moment, and through the so-called darkest hour of 1940-41, Britain never stood alone. Britain fought alongside peoples from across the empire and from across Europe. While the king might have been happy to have no allies, Churchill's coalition government and the brilliant minds that ran the Ministry of Information were going out of their way to ensure that the image they projected across the world and the image that was reaffirmed in this country was that this was a war of allies, an imperial conflict, but also a pan-European conflict. Just as Britain had opened her doors to refugees in previous centuries, during the Second World War, she became an island sanctuary for displaced people from across Europe. She also became a training ground for armies. Wartime Britain was the seat of several governments in exile, and she was the barracks and the training grounds for 6 European armies in exile. The Belgians, Dutch, and a force of Jewish Austrians trained in the valleys of Wales. The Polish and Norwegians built their barracks and training grounds in Scotland. And yet the myth of standing alone, of insularity, detachment, of pampered allies without whom we were better off, that we alone fought the war and won the war, that America and Russia were minor players, that's one that still in many areas dominates how the war is seen. There's a similar story to tell about another battle that we've come to define as a quintessentially British struggle, another apparent, clear-cut case of us versus them, whoever us are and whoever them are. In 2015, the country celebrated the Bicentenary of the Battle of Waterloo. UKIP described the upcoming EU referendum as their Waterloo. The same year, the historian Richard Evans did what historians are supposed to do and remind us of the facts. The reality about Waterloo, which I was not taught when I did history at school, is this: 36% of the soldiers fighting under Wellington were from the British Isles. 17% were Hanoverians, 13% were Dutch. 10% were from the King's German Legion, another 10% were from the province of Nassau in the Rhineland. 8% were from Brunswick, and 6% were Belgians, either Walloons or Flemings. Perhaps as many as 45% of the troops who began the day under Wellington were speakers of one of the many German dialects of the early 19th century. And as the Prussians, Britain's other ally, arrived on the battlefield, the German-speaking proportion of the Allied army increased. The former British Chief of the Defence Staff, Field Marshal Lord Bramall, once described Waterloo as the first NATO operation. Because as by the end of the day, as the French defeat became apparent, the majority of Allied soldiers were German speakers. Professor Evans described Waterloo as a European rather than a British or German victory. Why is it that that version of the battle, those statistics, that picture of that army and its ethnic makeup, why is it so distant from the common image? Why are the very worst of England's football fans, thankfully a small minority and a throwback to darker times? Why are they so fanatically committed to using a distorted version of our past to promote an idea of English exceptionalism? Why do they constantly reference the two world wars, the Battle of Britain, the Battle of Waterloo? And why do they regard these conflicts in their imagined image of Britain as a reason to hold our allies, our neighbours, our friends in contempt? And how have we for so long allowed our history to be weaponized like this? To act as the scaffolding for a ramshackled Heath Robinson version of our national story that is built on weak foundations and which constantly falls to bits when prodded by the most basic of factual assessments? Why is it that there are so many people who seem to be so offended by the idea that the Battle of Waterloo was a European rather than a British victory, or that the Battle of Britain or the Second World War was fought by Britain and the Commonwealth and Britain's allies? Why is the image of these multi-ethnic, multiracial, multi-faith armies and navies and air forces of the Second World War one that some people, find anathema to their version of their nation and their relationship to it? Why are so many people threatened by the idea that there were Roman Africans in Britain, that the army that fought on the first battles of the Western Front in 1915 at Neuve-Chapelle were British in India? Our relationship with Europe has never been an insular one. It's never been splendid isolation. It's never been what's been put forward by some people, by some politicians recently. We are constantly reminded that we are an island, as if no one had noticed. And yet, that isn't a way to ignore both geography and history. We are not an island. We're an archipelago, and we have a land border with another nation, Ireland. A nation whose history, it is obviously the case, has been incredibly intimately interconnected with that of England, Scotland and Wales. And historically, we have repeatedly been bound politically, geographically, economically to the continent. The ancient Roman province of Britannia was ruled from Rome for 4 centuries. The Norman kings who conquered England held lands in France. And from the 11th to the 16th centuries, the English crown ruled intermittently Calais, Normandy and Gascony. When the city of Calais was finally lost to France in 1558 under the reign of Queen Mary I, she famously said, "When I am dead and opened, you shall find Calais lying in my heart." It's been said that history has been drawn into our national identity crisis. My view is that this is not the case. What's happened is history has been conscripted into that crisis deliberately, but that forms of history contaminated with nostalgia, myopia, misremembering, and politicization are one of the root causes of that national identity crisis. Repeatedly in the debates around Brexit, we have been told that Britain needs to revive what is called the Old Buccaneering Spirit. That is a shocking phrase to use. The Buccaneers were pirates. And although I know what is meant metaphorically when people use that phrase, it is a worrying idea, and it speaks to a tendency, a latent belief that our relationships with others can be to dominate them, that we make up our own real rules, that we do not need to cooperate. One idea, a largely subconscious one perhaps, is that our natural relationship with the rest of the world is piratical or colonial and has to be fed through the misremembering of the past. Ever since the loss of the North American colonies, there was from time to time a strain of British thinking that believed we could somehow reassemble broken fragments of the empire. That idea, with the loss of the colonies in the 20th century and the dominions of the 20th century, has been revived. Churchill himself, who was half American, talked of a global alliance of the English-speaking peoples. And generations of historians of all political stripes have nursed similar ideas, most latterly calling the concept the Anglosphere. Brexit, we have been told, is the solution to revive this lost spirit, that outside Europe, Britain would be free to sign endless agreements with India, China, and the supposedly white nations of the Anglosphere, Australia, New Zealand, North America, Canada, South Africa. without having to reach consensus with European partners. Part of the problem with our relationship with these nations, our relationship with our colonial past, is that it has become an internal monologue. It largely focuses on what we did or did not do and whether we should be proud of it. What they, the people of and from the former empires and the current Commonwealth, feel about that history and what they think about it now rarely enters into this solipsistic debate, even though millions of the they are now citizens of this nation, our friends, our family members, our partners. Last year, Whitehall officials, perhaps it seems jokingly, described plans for a new post-Brexit trading relationship with the Commonwealth as Empire 2.0. And another neo-colonial fantasy has also been revived, the idea of Kanzuk, the dream of a free trade, free movement zone between the UK, Canada, Australia and New Zealand, three of what used to be called, unashamedly, the White Dominions. The argument goes that these nations have such a similar institutions and cultures to the UK that it's natural for us all to be brought together. In 1962, when the Labour leader Hugh Gaitskell gave a party conference speech in defence of the Commonwealth, he talked about the bonds forged between Britain and those exact nations during the First World War battles of Vimy Ridge and Gallipoli, in which troops from Canada in the first case and the Anzacs from Australia and New Zealand in the second had served bravely and suffered appalling losses. But a century after those battles, they are remembered in Vancouver, Auckland and Canberra as critical steps in the journey towards independence and nationhood and away from their status as British dominions. Once again, they have their own memories that don't always tally with what we are told are our memories and our history. This recent focus on the Commonwealth feels at times uncomfortably like a recent divorcee looking up his ex-girlfriends or boyfriends on Facebook, only to be horrified to discover that they've moved on. They've got married, they've had kids, they've had careers. They might have fond memories of us. They might even want to be on good terms, but they don't really miss us. Like old flames, former colonies have built new relationships based on their needs, not ours, their wants and their ambitions. They may be up for a better trade deal, maybe even freedom of movement, but they don't want to be part of Empire 2.0 any more than most of them wanted to be part of Empire 1.0. Geography and history stand in the way of these fantasies. Canada has cultural links with the UK, that's absolutely true, but it has a 5,500-mile land border with the US and a membership of NAFTA. Her main economic relationship is obviously inevitably with the United States. Australia and New Zealand have strong cultural, emotional links to the UK, but they're also set to be beneficiaries of a world moving east. In the Asian century, they found themselves near the greatest concentration of manufacturing and building in the world. Australia is in the midst of a mining boom akin to the gold rushes of the 19th century, and it is to Beijing, not London, that their importers and exporters look. In Africa, the game is up. The motorbikes on the freeways of Accra and Lagos are Chinese. They're assembled by local mechanics out of kits shipped directly from Shandong. West Africa's new convenience food is Chinese instant noodles, not fish and chips. And the supermarkets that sell them are South African. Anglophone Africans, like my own family, have strong, powerful, emotional, economic, and familial links to Britain. But those with money, again, embarrassing like my own family, want to go to Dubai on holiday for reasons I've never understood. The big cultural and musical influence on their kids is from the creative superpower that is Black America. Empire 2.0, Kanzuk, the Anglosphere. The idea that 400 years of imperialism in which we were somehow uninvolved. This is a version of the British past, which is increasingly unsustainable. A version in which no Polish or Czech pilot ever flew a Spitfire. No Jamaican ever took to the air in a Halifax or a Lancaster bomber. It is a fanciful and increasingly, I suspect, deliberate misremembering of the past. It's a delusion, and like all delusions, it can damage our relationships. Delusions lure us into false senses of security, and they inspire us to make bad decisions. There is another story to tell. That other story is more complex and less heroic, but it's also less solipsistic. It involves us and requires us to confront the painful as well as the glorious chapters of our past, but it has one overwhelming virtue. It is a shared history. It's the history of movement, migration, trade, exploitation and extraction, but also cultural fusion and reinvention. The way that those stories, those histories, the way that my profession is trying, I believe, to focus and refocus our attention onto those stories, those shared stories. That is the way to reach a nation that's comfortable with calling itself Blighty and with the history of that word. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I hope this works. I think it may. What we're going to do now is just talk amongst ourselves for 5 or 10 minutes. So, do as you please while we have a delightful chat. But I'm really very aware that I'm simply going to be a warm-up act for all of you. So I want to, as soon as possible, to introduce you to ask David your questions. I think there will be some roving microphones. And what we'll try and do is for the roving microphones can find a raised arm as quickly as possible so that we can absolutely fire a barrage, a blizzard, a hailstorm of questions. We don't want to waste any time while we have David here. Just to begin, David, thank you for that. Very refreshing and impressive survey of our own past. But I wonder, and I wondered while I was listening, does it ever make you uneasy? Because it makes me a bit uneasy, I suppose, or uncomfortable, or embarrassed, to feel that Enoch Powell and UKIP and the BNP and some of the other things you cite are taken to be exemplary representatives of Britishness, because as you would be the first to say, there are many strands in that. And many of us, and I think almost everybody in this room, would reject all of those things. And Enoch Powell himself was outcast and decried for the views he expressed, quite rightly. And so I always think that there's an embarrassment about empire and a guilty conscience about empire. And that's one of the reasons why it's shunned and not discussed. But you clearly feel that, particularly in the Brexit conversation, it was a powerful engine of recovering some kind of lost pride, going back to a golden age. And I just wondered if you could amplify on that a little bit.
Well, I think it had begun before Brexit. We had the famous YouGov poll, which was 2015, that said that 44% of the population believed the British Empire was a force for good in the world and something to feel pride about. Now, personally, I think debates about pride or shame when it comes to history are ridiculous. No one alive in this room was an 18th century slave trader or a 19th century explorer. I don't think these are very useful terms. But I do think that when historians like Neil Ferguson were writing their books on empire, they cited themselves as the revisionists. They said the establishment was what the Australians call the black armband view of history, that we had been battered into feeling bad about the past. Anything good about the empire had been trampled by these legions of lefty historians who'd made the whole thing toxic. Well, I don't think that was the case, but even if that is right, what the 2015 YouGov survey shows is that they won. Neil and his colleagues, and I know Neil and I like Neil, but they were victorious. The view that the empire was a force for good in the world is now the orthodoxy. So I think there's the reasons to confront this version of the past, this distorted misremembering of the empire, is because it's on the march. It's not this. John Darwin talks about people driving lancers into this kind of this already defeated corpse of the empire. I think that's 10 years out of date. This idea that the British Empire is what we want it to be, and that we in this island can decide whether it was a force for good, and that is a conversation we have among ourselves, and then we'll just tell India or China, we've sat down, we had a good chat about it, and I'm afraid the Opium Wars were all worth it. And that is a form of cultural arrogance, that we can't have those conversations because they haven't forgotten. What's happening in China with the memorialization of the destruction of the Summer Palace? In 1860, a British and French force destroyed the Summer Palace, which was one of the greatest jewels of Chinese civilization. It was during the Second Opium War. It was burnt to the ground, was first looted, obviously. Objects from it have been scattered all over the world. The Chinese have as you will know, they have a National Monuments Recovery Unit, which has a budget of millions. And it is going around the world telling museums and telling institutions that those artifacts were stolen and that they want them back. They're buying them back. Chinese billionaires, and there's no shortage of them, it seems, who want to win favor in their country. This is a country with 3,500 museums, are privately purchasing objects taken from the Summer Palace. Soldiers in the People's Army are taken to the ruins of the Summer Palace as part of their training. They've rebuilt the Summer Palace outside of Beijing with concrete, I'm afraid. China has not forgotten. And I'm really shocked by how much we convince ourselves the empire is what we decided to be, and with the presumption that it hasn't been remembered. April next year, the centenary of the Amritsar massacre. Now, the Congress Party is already mobilizing. Shashi Tharoor, the great Congress historian and I think brilliant historian, is already demanding an apology from the British state and from the royal family. Millions of people in India, hundreds of millions of people, are going to mark the Amritsar massacre. We don't get to decide. That's the thing about empire. It involves colonizing another people. We don't get to decide.
But you'd be hard put to find anyone here who thinks that the Amritsar massacre was anything other than a shameful disgrace.
That's true, but there's also a lot of people who will explain it all away. Of course it was a disgrace, but there was the railways. Of course there was famines in Bengal, but we gave them a legal system, not like they had a 5,000-year-old legal system based on one of the oldest religions on earth. There's what's called the sort of ledger book view of the empire, that what you do is you accept that there were bad things, but then you do two other things. You say, well, it was better than the Belgian Empire. Well, if you actually look at the Belgian Empire, who is in the private force publique of Leopold II, the number one ethnic group who are mercenaries fighting for him are British. And then you say, well, the bad things were outweighed by the good things. We may have exterminated almost the entire population of the people of Tasmania, but there's cricket. That balance sheet view of the empire, I mean, there's two things about it. One is I just think it's a bad way of telling history. And two, it's extremely arrogant. We don't get to decide whether the railway system was worth the Bengal famines.
But does it surprise you, given the amount of migration that imperial adventure generated? What a tremendous engine of moving people around the world, not just to and from Britain, but actually from India to the Caribbean and the displaced people everywhere. That is not more widely understood, that there is still a rather settled view of nation states and their identities as something inviolable and sacrosanct and at risk.
Well, because empire is normalized and its effects are manifest, we sometimes forget how kind of ridiculous it was, how audacious it was. And I mean, audacious is a kind of slightly glamorizing word, but it is the right word. When you think of a Jamaican or a Barbadian, you think of someone who's ethnically, racially African. That's one of the greatest reordering of the world. The Atlantic slave trade was one of the greatest demographic movements in all of history. And it was done for short-term, relatively short-term economic arguments. When it failed, as you said, Indians were moved all over the world. The Indian indentured labour system, the form of unfree labour that was used to replace the slave trade after 1838, pioneered by the Gladstone family, who had been the biggest recipients of compensation for slavery in the 1830s. That's the reason why there are Indian people in Trinidad, why there are Indians in Guyana, Indians in South Africa, Indians in Fiji. The world doesn't make sense without this history. And if you don't know this history and you land in Trinidad and then someone offers you a roti, and a curry. What do you think's happened? This history is important just for that, just for people to navigate the world as it is. It doesn't make any sense.
And it repeatedly comes back to bite you. I mean, just in this last year, we've had the Windrush generation scandal, and you must feel there are many other instances where an ancient commotion erupts in the present day, to everyone's astonishment, really. I mean, I don't suppose hardly anyone knew that was even happening.
Well, the Windrush scandal of 2018 is an amazing example, and it's in some ways the perfect example, because what happened in 2018 was anomalies of national identity and nationality, of passport holding, that were left over by a series of Immigration and Nationality Acts from 1948 to 1981. Those anomalies left over were like an unexploded bomb, and they could never have gone off. They could have lain dormant. But then the Immigration Acts passed from 2010 onwards. They triggered, and they accidentally, I still think it's accidental, they meant that 53,000 of our fellow citizens whose citizenship had never been formally sorted out after the 1971 Immigration Act suddenly found themselves in the crosshairs of a hostile environment that wasn't really intended for them. Now, there is an argument that when the government discovered that they should have done, and we don't know how early the government discovered that they were going to be affected, that they should have been withdrawn from that. If you were targeting recent migrants, then the people who'd lived in this country for 4 decades, 5 decades, and who came here when there were 3, should never have been caught into it. But what it reveals is a series of acts from 1948 onwards, with the British Nationality Act that you've written about very eloquently, that were actually about a way of withdrawing citizenship that Britain had given to non-white peoples, or reaffirmed of non-white peoples in 1948. Britain does a remarkable thing in 1948. It reaffirms that everybody in the empire has the same rights as everyone in Britain to live, to have residence, and to travel to Britain. And then black people turn up. And it went, no, we didn't mean you. It was intended so that people from Australia or New Zealand or South Africa could move around the empire, so Britain could bind those so-called white dominions to Britain. They just didn't think that black people would turn up. What they had not noticed was that thousands of extremely worldly, educated people from the Caribbean had fought in the Second World War. They'd seen the world, they'd travelled, they were highly skilled. And they believed in the empire, and they believed in their Britishness. And they came to Britain, and from 1948 onwards, from before the Windrush leaves Jamaica, British government after British government successively tries to shut the door and tries to stop them coming. Clement Attlee, who in my family's in the northeast, a white working class family, Clement Attlee in the 1945-51 Labour government is quasi-saintly. Clement Attlee tried to divert the people on the Windrush to pick peanuts in East Africa. Now, if you look, and it's online, go and look at the passenger list of the Windrush. Look at the skills that those people had. There's engineers, there's radio operators, there's machinists, there's students, there's 2 boxers. It's an incredibly wide range of skills. And then remember that this is post-war Britain. In 1946, Britain estimated it had 1.3 million shortage in labour. It needed 1.3 million workers to come to Britain. And here are 500 of them, with all of these amazing skills. And our Prime Minister says, send them to Kenya to pick peanuts, because we don't want them because of their skin colour.
That's one of the commonest misconceptions about immigrants, I think. Our project had an exhibition on the Calais refugees last year, and on the floor was stenciled the remarkable fact, most people stopped and looked at it for quite a long time, which was that 75% of the, I hesitate to call them inmates of that refugee camp, were graduates.
Yeah.
This was not the barbarian horde. This was not thieves and criminals. This was not a Trump-like invasion of the destitute. This was resourceful people of the world moving, which is one of those unstoppable things.
Yeah. But that use of language, I mean, we've had invasion as well as, I'm afraid, cockroaches in recent years. If you look at the documents from the 40s and 50s describing Caribbean migrants, there's the word influx and there's the word incursion by British cabinet ministers. It's the same language. And these are British people, highly skilled British people. I mean, there's one historian, it's probably hyperbole, but it's beautiful hyperbole, says that the post-war labour shortage was the biggest labour shortage since the Black Death. Lovely idea. I want it to be true. This is not a country that can afford, yeah. Well, there'll be another one next year.
Another play.
But this is not a country that can afford to mess around with migration. And we know this because in the same time that the governments are trying to stop the Windrush from coming and trying to persuade other people not to come, they are scouring the displaced persons camps of Eastern Europe, encouraging and recruiting Eastern Europeans. So this country that doesn't want 500 Jamaicans and Barbadians and Guyanese, half of them who'd fought in the Second World War, most for the RAF, most of them were highly skilled. It doesn't want them for their skin colour. This country at the same time imports 8,000 men from the Ukraine who'd fought in the Waffen-SS against Britain. If you'd rather have people who'd fought for the Nazis, although very often compelled and conscripted without much choice, but if you'd rather have people who wore the swastika uniform than men who'd fought for the RAF for racial reasons, then race is at the centre of your thinking.
Yes. Although, do you not think, perhaps, with the way you talked about the Windrush scandal, that some of that was a bureaucratic bungle? And it has been said, I think, famously, that one should hesitate to ascribe to malevolence things that could equally well be ascribed to stupidity. And in the
I would love to believe that. I think the documents repeatedly, the documents from both the post-war Labour government and Churchill's administration, what they talk about is they use the phrase "our people," as in that these aren't our people. But they also use. Lord Salisbury says we can't become a magpie society.
I don't doubt it remotely, but in the last few years, in the kind of commotion and furore over Brexit and so forth, the animosity was directed largely at Eastern European, and therefore there was not so much of a racial component in that. Would that be fair?
It is. I had the bizarre experience of being in the back of a taxi a few years ago with a Jamaican taxi driver complaining about Bosnians. And it's utterly surreal. I mean, I've been in the back of a taxi in Dublin with an Irish taxi driver complaining about immigrants, going past the statue of the immigrants leaving Dublin Harbour. So being of an immigrant background, even a recent immigrant background, seems to be no defence emotionally and psychologically from making those comments.
That's called assimilation, I think. That's called becoming British through and through.
That's the nice way of putting it.
Now, do we have some questions in the audience? I'm sure we will. Right in front of me here, there's an arm. And then if a microphone, I don't know how many microphones we have actually, but please hand it. And then as soon as possible, and once you've asked your question, let's move the microphone around as fast as we can.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, thank you. So you mentioned British parties and their far-right representations of Britishness, but I'd like to draw our attention to more covert imperialist institutions such as SOAS, who ironically have you standing on the stage but have a very hard time in accepting their colonial history and turning that around. In 2016, the Decolonising Board refused to accept the word reparations in their documents until this day reject black scholars on their reading list for being too radical. So in these efforts, we ignore black and brown bodies who have been marginalised in history. And where do we start structurally to turn our attention outwards?
I think David's just very eloquently demonstrated how he feels about that, but do you want to include institutes like SOAS?
I think we start with your generation, because your generation is causing this shift. Glasgow University wouldn't have done what it's done. Bristol University is about to admit that some of the foundation money for that university came from slavery and slave compensation. It's happening. We're changing reading lists, we're changing curriculum because your generation is pushing for it. You're doing it, and my generation didn't. And it will only happen if you keep doing it. If you keep doing exactly what you've done, stand up and point your finger at the institutions that we're part of. That's true of the institutions I work for as well. But it is, your generation has done this. I mean, I don't know if you saw the Royal Historical Society's report 2 weeks ago of the disastrous failure of British universities to have black faculty, to include colonial studies, imperial studies, black history in their curriculums. Compare that to America. Well, America changed because in the 1960s, black students literally locked themselves into Cornell University and other places and demanded this. And what do they have? They have Cornell West and Henry Louis Gates as a result. We didn't have that, so we haven't got this. Your generation is the generation that's going to do what the American students did in the 1960s, force change. And we owe you enormously.
And do you feel that is to push at a closed door or a door that is at least ajar?
I think it's we've done the work of pushing the door slightly ajar. But it's come through. I mean, we are at an amazing moment of change in all sorts of ways. The thing which I'm reminded of by friends who write about politics is that we should remember that while Trump is happening, there's also an incredible change in America. There's more mixed-race relationships in America than there's ever been. There's more families that are integrated in ways that could never happen. In the Deep South, there's a huge number of people who have friendships and families that cross racial lines. Amazing things are happening. I do lots of talks in Black History Month. You go to American firms in London, and their focus on diversity and inclusion is just incredible. So the world is... In some ways, Trump is a reaction to the fact that lots and lots of things are going really, really right. We're asking really, really difficult questions about gender fluidity, about misogyny, about race, about class. Lots of things are going really, really well, and we are at a tipping point, and we're also seeing a backlash against that. But my friends who write about politics, they urge me to be more optimistic and to see it in those terms.
I think it's quite easy to see someone like Trump as a symptom of things rather than as a cause of things. But do you ever worry that investigating and interrogating and running a judicial inquiry over history is difficult at a time when the world is changing so very quickly? I mean, I was in India last week, and the vastness and the energy and the dynamism of everything that is happening there. And you were talking about China earlier, and we know all about the tremendous initiatives around the world. I learned not long ago that while we continue our 40-year quibble about a third runway at Heathrow, China is there are 47 airports under construction in China. You know, so the world is moving at the most enormous pace and scale. And should we be cautious about being over self-referential, actually? Is it in any way self-indulgent to be tying up in and anxious not about our own past instead of contemplating the future?
I mean, a friend of mine in publishing said, all publishing is really vanity publishing. I think there's probably lots of truth in that. I think that the act of, the reality of having the time to study rather than being in a field getting enough calories is an amazing privilege. But I think there's a responsibility in lots of these histories. I think we are a better country, and I think we are a country that is capable of accepting the goods and the bad of our history. I look at Germany. Now, Germany has by no means confronted all of its historical ghosts. Germany has a profound blind spot about its colonial history. But Germany's relationship to its past is of a past that is lots of wonderful things, lots of heroes, but it's also of cautionary tales. And that willingness to look at your past is not a place to go to feel good about yourself, but a place to go to confront difficult questions about your nation, about human nature. I think that's a more realistic and healthy relationship with the past. And I do think that we need to get there. And I do think one of the aspects of India's incredible moment of dynamism is that revived interest in the history of the Raj. When Shashi Tharoor did his speech at Oxford, 63 million people watched it in the first 2 weeks. 63 million people, most of them in India, because finally someone was saying that the railways didn't make up for the Bengal famine, and that India, the biggest economy in the world before the British turned up, 2% of the world economy by the time Britain left, hadn't given them all of these gifts. They had exploited and extracted them for 3 centuries. And the power of that message is part of the power of India. And I think in some ways Britain's got a kind of amazing opportunity, because for some incredible reason, most people still like us. I don't know how we've managed to do this, but there is a kind of great willingness to forgive and forget. But we need to acknowledge there needs to be truth before there can be reconciliation. And I think the desire for reconciliation in most of these countries is there, and it's partly there because they're doing so well that it's easy to be magnanimous when you're going to be one of the biggest economies in the world.
There's a question right here at the front, and then one just behind, so that if we can move the microphone. And can we try and get a microphone to a hand while we speak? So if you find the hand there.
I just wanted to get a historical feel for the idea of reparations over time. What guidelines would you apply when you're saying, does this society owe something to that society, and what the time period happens? Or is it really cautionary tales and knowing when you did something wrong, don't repeat it? Or how do you feel about reparations? How far do they go?
Well, I think the simplest way of understanding reparations is to look at those reparations that were paid. So when France went back to Haiti in the 1840s with battleships and forced the people of Haiti to pay back their gold that impoverished that country right through into the 20th century, there was no issue about, well, it's been a while. The people of Haiti were made to pay for generation after generation compensation to France for themselves. They paid for their own bodies because their bodies were owned by France. And France went there with military force to enforce this. There's been all sorts of reparations that have happened. So I think there is a pardon?
Isn't it being imposed by the...
Oh, it has, yeah, for the most part.
What do you think about the moral question? That's what I'm asking.
Well, I think Britain has a debt to all sorts of countries, but I'm on record of saying that I don't think the reparations debate at the moment is a useful place to be, because I think I'm a historian. I have a friend, one of my best friends studied philosophy, and I studied history, and he's an optimist, and I'm normally terrified. I think we're in an extremely frightening place. We have a man in the White House who can't condemn white supremacists. We have the Guardian reporting that 1 in 4 people yesterday in Europe vote for populist parties. Populism is fascism light. I think we're in a terrifying moment in British history, in European history, and world history, in which the post-war consensus that we all got very, very lazily used to has broken down faster than anyone could have predicted. And I think that one of the ways this has happened is because extremely sophisticated, clever people using extremely sophisticated technology have weaponized class against race and gender and diversity. And I think reparations would be weaponized within seconds. Steve Bannon said, he dreams the Democrats will keep talking about race and not class. Bernie Sanders says if he went down the reparations route in America, that it would destroy the Republican Party. And I think they're right. I don't want to think this. I would like us to be in a position where we can make moral decisions and think about a sort of Marshall aid plan for those countries that never recovered from the enslavement that was their reason for creation. But we're in a more frightening place than that. Now, I enormously respect people like Hilary Beckles who have done the work and built this case, and I think there is a moral case. I think the political case doesn't exist.
Or simply that the timing is wrong.
Yeah, at this moment.
Timing, the zeitgeist.
Well, there's a terrible danger that people people like me on the left, that we still fight the battles of the 1960s. So Robert Reich, who was Clinton's Labour Secretary and now a sort of campaigner and author, he describes that post-war period as the almost golden age. The problem with the post-war period was that you had this El Dorado, but black people and women, other ethnic minorities were excluded from it. Well, we doubt that doesn't exist anymore, because in the 1970s, the process of expelling the white working class from that El Dorado took place.
It's been said that the achievements of one age are the problems and challenges of the next. And one of the things we aspire to, I suppose, our migration project, our museum idea, is that black history and race history and imperial history and colonial history are not regarded as rivalrous, separate fields from British history, but as part of British history. And is that a premature wish, do you think? I mean, are we? Is that hoping for too much? I suppose we want black history simply to be a thread within the British story, because, as you say, and as we believe, it is one and has always been.
I mean, this is my dream, and that it was the the premise of the book Black and British, is that this is a shared history. And although, politically I'm very pessimistic, I do believe in this country's capacity to have shared histories. And in some ways it's unavoidable. 1 in 3 children in England, not Britain, is either black or BME. That's the Britain. The future demographic projections, you go to an infant school and you can see it. It's already happened. This country has somehow managed to create this level of diversity and mixing and interaction that is unique. This is the most diverse city on the world. It's not New York, as I was taught when I was a kid. It's London.
That implies a major confusion, though, doesn't it, between the kind of actual daily life of the country, which is people falling in love and having relationships and having children and getting on with life and being cosmopolitan and, in fact, enjoying the encounter and the difference and the colourful threads that exist in Britain, while at the level of the kind of politics and newspaper headlines and angry debate, a very different voice is heard.
I think that's always been the way. This is the reason why I'm interested in the Windrush story. The classic way on television we've told the Windrush stories, we have the bit of archive of the guy from the Caribbean in the snow trying to find a house, and it's like no blacks, no Irish. And what that version of the story does is it's these horrible working class people who were the force that created this racism. And it doesn't say that some of it was a government policy, that some of it was stemmed from Whitehall. It doesn't say that the British government were advising and asking labour exchanges to spy on the black population to prove that they were lazy and couldn't do work. I think the most Caribbean migrants, the story they often told was they thought the country was 3/3. 1/3 of people who were implacably racist, who wouldn't give you the time of day. 1/3 of people who could go either way, and 1/3 of people who just were not racist. Now that's the white side of my family. My grandparents had never met any black people until my mum brought my father home, and then they looked after their mixed race grandchildren. Yes. A few years ago, I was on a beach in the south coast. I was walking with my dogs, and I saw this big guy, this big white guy, with England flags and tattoos of bulldogs. And he was the sort of person I was frightened of as a child. And I had reason to be frightened as a child because I lived through an awful lot of racial violence. And I caught his eye, and all my childhood fearfulness came back. And then I saw that he wasn't looking at me, he was looking past me. And his little mixed-race granddaughter ran out of the surf into her grandfather's arms. And it was just such a beautiful moment. The journey he's been on, from the young man who had those tattoos to the life he leads now, the journey the country's been on. Millions of people have been on that journey, and that's where I found my optimism. But I think we get to that place by being honest about our history. And I think the work I do, although it's a bit pointy and shouty, I think it's about we need to cure this wound, and being untruthful about the past isn't going to help.
Yes. Sorry, there was the question there. I'm sorry to be
No,
slow.
that's okay. So my question's about history teaching. And I think I'm increasingly concerned because there are amazing projects like Justice to History, which are trying to encourage a more nuanced picture of British history. But increasingly with the political system, we have history teachers that are trained in silos because of academisation of schools. So people are not going to the Institute of Education. They're actually getting trained in really quite isolated circumstances. How do you think the history teachers can overcome those challenges? Because their role is so important with the future of how we tell our history.
Yes, the subject of history, the state of the nation thought on history teaching.
Well, I'm always very careful to not criticise teachers in the classroom because I have 2 sisters and an auntie who are teachers. This is being recorded. It's Christmas soon. It could be a really frosty Christmas dinner But there's always been a problem, and it's not just with black history. One of my older sisters, one of the teachers, her PhD was in the 5 reports that led to the drafting of the 1870 Education Act. And what she loves to show me is that when you get to those reports, when you get to the history bit, every question is about how do we use history to create the outcome we want? How do we use history to create national unity? How do we use history to disguise class divisions? How do we use history to make boys feel that they should join the Navy? Not how do we teach history? not what is the value of history. It's how does history perform a utilitarian function. And no one's going, God, how do we use chemistry to forge the nation? What can physics do to create a sense of the British nation? History's always been a political football because of the nature, because it is by its nature a political subject. So in some ways, this problem is age-old, and if it's not black history before the 1960s, it was history of the working class. I mean, we forget sometimes that it took that generation of great historians like E.P. Thompson to drive working class history into the curriculum. So we're always fighting for a bigger thing. But the thing which I'm really, really aware of, and here I'm channeling my relatives, is that they have so little time and they have a prescriptive curriculum. My sister tells a story that when she was at school back in the 70s, one day one of her teachers told her how lucky the class were, because if they were Russian children, they'd been sitting down to a national curriculum, all being taught the same, because that's what they do in these terrible, restricted, directed, state-controlled nations. And aren't you wonderful to be lucky and living in the free West, where teachers are free to teach what they want?
Oscar Wilde said the only duty we really owe history is to rewrite it. So that's what you're busily doing. This will have to be the last question, I fear, from the gentleman there, because I'm afraid we're already over time, I think, but please.
So very much a question which I think builds on the previous one. I think what came across in your talk was that implicitly Britain effectively disarmed itself as regards the negotiations for leaving the EU, in part because of its delusions of empire. I just wondered whether you had any thoughts as to how we would, as a nation, rearm, in inverted commas, ourselves for the sort of the future and the realpolitik that we'll need to survive in the great new world.
What is your programme for rearmament? I know you're very keen on it.
Well, I haven't looked at the news for about 10 minutes. I don't know where we are, and I'm terribly out of date about what's happening with the pace of events. I mean, it has to be said, even though it's obvious that people voted for leave for all sorts of reasons, and it wasn't just about race, and it wasn't just about empire. But I think that the atmosphere that was able to be created in some quarters was built on a fantasy version of British history. And I think it was so ironic that when our first delegation after Brexit went to India to begin what were, of course, going to be the easiest trade negotiations in all of human history, we were told that one of the stipulations that the Indians put was they wanted more visas. They wanted more movement. There were a lot of people who voted, I don't know how many, there were some people who voted Brexit, and there were some vox pops with people who voted Brexit to get rid of their Muslims. They really need to look at a map if they think that Pakistan is in the EU. But I think that to have these levels of delusions, these levels of an unwillingness to confront the truth of our relationship with other countries, both the good and the bad, just a general level of ignorance. I think that was this part of the soil from which these ideas sprung. Now, there were lots of reasons. People didn't want to be in the EU because of the Commonwealth, the Common Agricultural Policy. I used to work for Minister of Agriculture when I was a kid, and if I had a reason to leave the EU, it would be the Common Agricultural Policy. And I have legitimate problems with the EU. Their treatment of fisheries in West Africa has impoverished places I've been to on the coast of Nigeria and Ghana and Togo. It's not a perfect institution. And my issue is not really with the EU. It's with the atmosphere that was created around that vote, which pre-existed, which I think is enabled by a version of our past, which ignores our friends, ignores our allies, ignores our relationship. Take our relationship with the First World War. I insisted on putting on the cover of my book, with the First World War, French soldiers. We just got to the end of the Centenary. We barely mentioned Verdun. We barely mentioned the titanic battles of Chemin des Dames, the Nivelle Offensive, the Somme Offensive I was part of the broadcasts. We made rightly a huge deal of the Somme Offensive. The Somme was a counter-attack to take the pressure off the French at Verdun. We have this version in which not just our allies, the people who we fought and shed our blood alongside, they're invisible, as well as our colonial, the peoples of the Commonwealth. It's this solipsism. It's dangerous. Like I said, I think delusions lead people to bad decisions.
One delusion we may have, going back to your question there, in India, where I was last week, it was widely said that one thing the Brexit vote had achieved was something that 400 years of patient British foreign policy had been designed to prevent, which is successfully uniting the whole of Europe against us. On which cheerful note, I must thank you all again for coming, and in particular to thank David Olusoga.
Thank you. Thank you.
I've been asked just to conclude with a few very brief announcements. The first is that David will be willing to sign some books afterwards, I believe, if you get his arm in the correct lock. Also, I think on your seats there are sort of questionnaire forms to evaluate the evening and what we do and so forth, and I feel very bad even mentioning this because I absolutely hate those kind of forms. Since flying back last week, I've been bombarded with questionnaires from British Airways, which pretty much makes me vow never to ever go with them again. But sadly, it turns out to be extremely useful. So if any of you have an empty few moments and can bear to fill in the form, it is very helpful for us to learn what it is you think we should be doing, shouldn't be doing, could do better, could do worse, and so forth. Finally, can I just intrude on the evening to say that any of you who want to take more of an interest in our Migration Museum project, please do approach the members of the team. They're here. I don't know if they could stick an arm up or wave or make themselves visible. Oh gosh, they're everywhere. Is there anyone here who's not a member of the please do accost them. They're very keen to be accosted. They won't wave you away at all. Finally, there is a drinks reception for anyone who wishes to come. It'll probably be a bit of a crush out there, so all I can suggest is to push and shove as fast as you can, and that way you'll find your way to David. Thank you all again very much for coming.